I am just flabbergasted by the turnout of so many friendly and new faces that decided to join us this morning. I hope that you get to enjoy the talk, and I'll be sharing some things that are really close and personal to me and my family and my community. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. In Tagalog, this means good morning, everyone. Tagalog is one of the hundreds of native dialects spoken across the Philippines. And speaking of Philippine culture, I know many of you have had a chance to enjoy some of our goodies today. So thank you for indulging in our delicious food. If my kababayan, as Jules mentioned, my fellow country people, are anywhere near your orbit, you'll know that every Philippine feast is chocked with boatloads of food. And if you have not experienced our community's generosity yet, I encourage you to attend a Philippine social or potluck, because at that point you will know exactly what I mean. It's an honor to be in this room today in sold-out crowd, standing alongside some of the most creative people in our city, whether you know it or not. A huge thanks to Dr. Christine Watson for the invitation to join you here today, as well as the tremendous Creative Mornings team. You've all been so wonderful to work with. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our family's story. And it's really wonderful to be in such an iconic space here at Jane's, which also serves as an incubator for some really impressive culinary talent that has taken our city by storm and also works at our restaurant too. So it's a really wonderful space. Speaking of the next generation, I'd like to start today's presentation by asking everyone in this room here today a very simple, yet very important question. It's a question that I ask myself often, and a question that dictates how I make my choices today and pave my choices in the future. That question is, what will be your legacy? What is your greater purpose? What lasting impact do you hope to leave behind? And follow-up question for you. Did you think when you registered for today's event that we'd be talking about the fun inner workings of running a restaurant and maybe swapping some yummy, delicious Philippine recipes? Or did you think we'd be veering into the territory of an existential crisis, questioning our purpose in life? I know we're really digging real deep for a Friday morning coffee chat, but please stay with me, because I genuinely believe that thinking deeply about the theme of legacy has helped me learn so much about myself, about my family, and about those closest to me. And today, we're going to explore how every action that we've taken, every idea that we have dreamed up, every desire that we've spoken out into the universe has purpose and meaning. And what I'll also share with you today is a recipe for my secret sauce, a formula that has helped shape every choice that I make as a business owner, as a community builder, as a lifelong learner, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, and as a friend. Now, when I think about the idea behind the secret sauce, I would liken it to a mirepoix, which is a foundational recipe that used in cooking that relies on 3 key ingredients to add depth and dimension into any dish. In French cooking, you may be familiar with their trio that's made up of onions, celery, and carrots. Now, in the Philippine culture, our mirepoix is called a holy trinity. It's an aromatic blend of browned garlic, onions, and ginger. You may be smelling that from the hot tables over there. And once I learned this about cooking, I soon came to the realization that this concept, this idea of basing an idea off of 3 foundational pillars or 3 foundational ingredients, could also be applied to how we shape our lives and build our own legacies. The secret sauce, this holy trinity for a way of being, in my mind, is made up of 3 C's: creativity, culture, and community. Now, by blending these 3 ingredients together, I've been able to unlock new levels of gratitude, of fulfillment, and of self-love that I never knew was possible. And over the next 10 minutes, I hope to share with you some ideas on how we can dig deeper into your own personal histories and your backstories to unleash your potential and formulate your own secret sauce recipe. All right, so let's start by talking about the first ingredient, which is culture. So as a second-generation kid who was raised to assimilate into the Canadian culture, what little I knew of my Philippine ancestry depended heavily on the stories, on the language, and the traditions that my parents had shared with me. My parents, my mom and dad pictured here during their Canadian wedding ceremony, first immigrated here in the late 70s. Both of them grew up in the rural farmlands of the Philippines in Southern Leyte in the Visayas region. The two were raised in traditionally large families, and the legacy that their parents had in mind was to continue cultivating their farmland and running their very small businesses to ensure not only did their children have food on their table, but to also ensure that their children had the stability and foundation that they needed to succeed. And it was thanks to my ancestors and my grandparents, we call them lolos and lolas in our language, that my parents had the support they needed to dream big and consider what a life could look like beyond the fences of their farms. They came to Canada because, like many immigrants, they saw this as a land of opportunity. And it was and still is, but times were different back then. Remember, this was nearly half a century ago. Like, that's kind of crazy to think about. And many of the social safety nets and support systems that we know today simply did not exist back then. While we were lucky enough to have a couple family members here who sponsored their immigration to Canada, their resources otherwise were completely limited. They had very few dollars in their pockets, limited connections, and of course, limited backup plans. And despite all of these adversities that they faced, they had their sights set on the endless possibilities synonymous with a future here in Canada. And regardless of how cushy this picture looks like here, and this photo is one of my very first birthdays at our family home. I know it's very misleading because they look so stylish in profiling, but the reality was far from it. My parents, in all honesty, they spent most of their years struggling financially. We barely made enough between their multiple jobs to live above the poverty line. We received a lot of hand-me-downs, a lot of handouts, and shopped mostly secondhand. And I have many fond memories of splurging at the dollar store and getting so riled up and excited about a cheap $1 plastic toy that would sustain me until the next very distant shopping trip. Without transferable post-secondary accreditations to fall back on, both my parents ended up working in very labor-intensive roles, often working on assembly lines, working with heavy machinery, and eventually my dad was laid off when his employer migrated their operations across the border. And while searching for his next gig, he ended up deciding to scale up, and lo and behold, he ended up going to culinary school. And he subsequently spent several years working in the hospitality sector until he ended up following my mother down a conventionally more stable path, working for the government as a healthcare aide. For them, this type of stability was an immigrant's wish fulfilled. And despite the limited money my parents made, what they always made sure of, no matter what, no matter how few dollars we had in our bank accounts, they always made sure that we ate well. These traditional meals that they cooked up between working their multiple jobs helped me understand the elegance and the meaning behind our Holy Trinity. Those brown garlic, onions, and garlic flavors in all the foods that we ate. And while we spent little time talking about our ancestral histories, it was through these dishes that I began piecing together some form of cultural identity. And now that you know a little bit more about my family's backstory, let's talk about the second key ingredient, creativity. I know I was much cuter back then. For as long as I can remember, I've always been driven by creative pursuits. Over the years, I've dreamed of and sadly ditched many potential creative career paths. When I was 8, I wanted to be a hairstylist. When I was 12, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to be a magazine publisher? Such a flashy, fun job. When I was 14, I did a lot of film editing, and by the time I graduated high school, my mind was set on becoming a concept artist for video game design. I ended up bouncing around between attending the UW, the U of M, and even took a year off to work a sales gig before finally figuring things out. And it was after those three years of aimless wandering that I ended up applying to RRC Polytech's Creative Communications program. And one of my amazing instructors is here, Melanie Lee Lockhart, and I have to owe it to amazing instructors like her that have helped envision what a future could look like in this field and beyond. So thank you, Melanie. Upon graduation, I spent the following decade in the nonprofit and corporate social responsibility sectors. In these roles, I worked for and alongside many grassroots local organizations in our city that were making real and meaningful change happen for diverse and dynamic equity-seeking groups. And I'll be honest, I loved this work, and I often reminisce upon it fondly. And it was also thanks to these experiences that I realized how much the idea of community building meant to me. And while the work at its core was fulfilling, there was still something that was missing. There was a part of me and my personal identity as a Philippine Canadian that just wasn't coming through these careers that I pursued. I felt like my identity became synonymous with the employers that I was working for at the time, having very little creative latitude over how I showed up and represented myself in community. So what I would end up doing is drafting up business ideas in the margins of my notepads between meetings, and the creativity I couldn't express in my full-time corporate gig came pouring out when I put my pen to those scrap pieces of paper. And thus, the conceptualization, this idea of Tito Boys as we see it today, came easy. What was the hard part? The hard part was pulling the trigger. For recent and generational immigrants, our families took a tremendous and terrifying risk. Odds are they moved halfway across the world to a country that was dramatically different than their own, with different climates, different languages, with different support systems, governments, and social systems. For them, their leap of faith, it was already taken. To take another major risk, that would be a huge gamble, putting everything they worked so hard for here in Canada on the line. And knowing this in our Philippine culture, the idea of taking a risk, like opening up a business, is far from that safe and predictable path. And despite this, and despite all of the judgment and preconceived notions of what a life and safe life could look like here in Canada, my parents were wonderful, and they empowered me to defy these expectations by carving my own path, one that will help us start building a new generation of legacy. So while on maternity leave with my second girl, and on the precipice of my dad retiring from a 16-year-long career as a healthcare aide, we decided, what the hell, let's just do the damn thing. So we finished drafting our business plan, secured our financing, leased and renovated our commercial space, all in the span of 6 months. It was a wild and crazy time. And our doors eventually opened the same week I was set to return for maternity leave in October of 2022. And that leads us to our third and final key ingredient, which is community. It's been a year and a half since we've opened our doors, and the connections we've made, once haphazard, often through virtual computer screens, are now exclusively made in person, face-to-face, across our family's dinner table. It's these real human connections that we embrace every day and help us realize the community that we're building we're doing so in a much deeper and more meaningful way. Our shop welcomes friends, old and new, from so many different walks of life. We're overjoyed to serve both Philippine and non-Philippine patrons from communities as close as Gimli to cities like NYC to distant and foreign places like Dubai. And we rejoice in seeing newcomers and multi-generational families who are keen to reconnect with the familiar flavors of their ancestral homelands. What makes this place so special is that we foster intergenerational and intercultural connections that allow for community members to learn not only a little bit more about their Philippine cultures, but to maybe take a moment and look inward and learn a little bit more about themselves. And I'll be the first to admit that this work is far from glamorous. I've never had so much food stuck between my fingernails up until starting working in this job. But when running a business, especially a small family-owned restaurant like ours, you are choosing to make sacrifices. You sacrifice your free time, you sacrifice your sleep, you sacrifice your salary, your benefits, your pensions, and sometimes your own sanity. But the sacrifice, I'll tell you, it is absolutely worth it. And it's worth it because when you finally take that time to step back and appreciate the relationships you've helped cultivate and the community that you've helped create, you realize, like, this is worth it. This is our why. And I owe a great deal of our success as a business to our massively talented team. A few members here today, of course. Our team, which is also multi-generational and multicultural, continues to teach me every day why the work that we do here is so important. And they also remind me how fulfilling this work can be when you have the chance to express your cultural and personal narratives through the foods that we eat. And when I witness the strength of our team, I also think about the lasting impact our business and choices have on our future generations. As someone who often speaks on the topic of DEIB, the term intergenerational trauma will come up when we discuss how racialized and equity-seeking groups are trapped in harmful cycles of oppression. A lot of this trauma stems from this idea of scarcity, living in a perpetual state of survival mode and having to fight for those scarce resources, limiting our ability to thrive and succeed. And today, I'm grateful for our family because we have learned not only to adapt, but we have looked past this trauma with an abundance mindset. And thanks to their sacrifices, I get to live a very privileged life that is grounded not in intergenerational trauma, but in intergenerational possibilities. Right. So now that you know our story, I hope you've been able to connect the dots between those lived experiences and our secret sauce. It was through this holy trinity of culture, creativity, and community that I found the answer to how our family is building our lasting legacy. This legacy is just laid out simply in this easy-to-follow recipe. And I hope this recipe will serve as a helpful tool for you to begin, or perhaps to continue, thinking about the dent that you hope to carve in your universe. Your legacy is going to be about the souls that you've reached, the minds that you changed, and the hearts that you've touched. Whether your legacy reaches 1 person or 1 million people, know that it will leave an everlasting mark, and it will matter so deeply to those people that you touch. Now, I guess we're going to be wrapping up here. It was so much fun. This felt like so grateful that we all had a chance to connect today, and I'm so excited to see where all of your legacies are going to lead in the work that you do and the change that you're going to collectively make as a community. Now I'll finish off by posing the same question to you as we did at the start of today's session. What will be your legacy? Thank you so much.